We're going to carry on with our sermon series today, Wellness in the Wilderness. So why don't we give a big hand to Paul as he comes to speak.
Hi everybody, it's really nice to see you. This is my first week back after a couple of weeks of holiday, which has actually been really nice. It was actually nice to catch up with some family. We were down on the south coast for a few days and it was absolutely freezing. But I was so desperate to see my mum. The thing is, I'm one of those kind of fair weather sort of people. They talk about like fair weather golfers or whatever. I'm like a fair weather everything. I don't really like to leave the house if it's not very warm. But Caroline from Petersfield, the famous Caroline from Petersfield, was on the south coast, so we really wanted to see her. And so there I was, sitting in a pub garden with my jeans on and 2 T-shirts and 2 jumpers and a coat and a bobble hat on, just desperately trying to keep warm. And I would have been wearing my jogging tights, only it seems that the kind of lockdown diet that I've been eating has shrunk my clothes. How's that happened? You know, it was so lovely to see my mum though, but it just wasn't quite the same. We weren't allowed to hug, and I don't know about you, but having kind of gradually emerging from lockdown, it feels weird being among people, and there's this kind of adjustment thing that we all have to go through. We're living through these extraordinary, weird times. I wonder if you can relate to that. You know, my example is fairly trivial, and I've had the benefit of, over the last year or so, living with my family, who are my 4 favourite people in the world. But for some of us, this last season has just been so tough. Many of us are dealing with a profound wilderness experience. And so we're trying to answer the question, how do we as individuals and also as the church find wellness in the wilderness? Not just coping, not just getting through it, but how do we find a kind of equilibrium of life that feeds us, that sustains us, that nourishes us, that we might even grow some fruit in this time. We might get to the end of this and find that actually we're more connected to God and to each other, that we know each other better, that we're feeling better in ourselves. So we've been looking at the 10 Commandments. The Israelites who were given the beginning of 40 years in the wilderness, like a whole generation and a bit in the desert experience. At the start of their journey, God speaks to Moses and he lays out this pattern to live by. And so the first 3 commandments are about putting God first, and Kath spoke about that a couple of weeks ago. And then the next one's about Sabbath and rest, and Tom spoke about that last week. And today we're going to be looking at Commandments 5 to 9. And it's going to come up on the screen behind me. Hooray! It says this, "Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor." That's it. Wow. Like sex and death. The kind of 2 big taboos in one thing. And it says you have to be nice to your parents. My goodness. The first thing that I want to say is that these commandments have an eye on the end of the story. The Israelites, they're just at the beginning of their wilderness experience. But it says, so you may live long in the land the Lord your God is going to give you. So you're at the present walking through the desert for an unknown duration that's going to turn out to be 40 years. But one day you're going to come out of the desert and put your feet onto the land that God is promising you. You know, that's true for us as well. One day this wilderness that we're walking through will end. But in order to survive, not just the now when it's hard, but also in the promised land when it gets easier, God gives them this template to live. Because some lessons are best learned in the wilderness. Wouldn't it be great if when we reached the land that we were thriving there? When I was a teenager, I was in the Scouts. In fact, I wasn't just in the Scouts. I was in the Beavers, and then I was in the Cubs, and then I was in the Scouts, and then I was in the Venture Scouts. I think they've changed it all around now. But that's like a whole decade and a bit of kind of geekery, basically. Like hanging out with my mates in extreme circumstances. And each year we used to go away on these summer camps. And towards the end of the week, the older kids, we would be sent off on an expedition. And we would pack our backpacks that were bigger than us with the tents and the kind of dried curries we used to take with us, and the water and all that we needed to carry. And we'd set out on these expeditions. And there were hilarious moments like, you weren't there. There's this guy, Adam Bird. He thought that the best thing, we had this tent that had poles that you had to put over the kind of outside, and then you hung the inside tent. But he didn't want the tent poles to get wet, so he kept trying to put up the tent from the inside. Or there was this guy, Justin, who had never been outside suburbia before, and yet he was followed for a whole afternoon by a sheep that took a particular liking to him. Or there was one time we were on this remote Scottish island. It was just getting dark. We'd missed the last ferry back to the mainland, and we knocked on the door of this farmhouse to ask the farmer if we could park on his land. And all we got was a stream of expletives, and he threw us off the land. The point is that we learnt so much more than tent skills in those countryside wilderness experiences. The best place for us to learn so much about ourselves and about what we're called to do and the way to live is best learned in the wilderness. And so it struck me that we have these Israelites in this brutal situation. They fled from Egypt. There are hundreds of thousands of them. You know, if you add up all of the adults and the children, there are probably millions of these people, all on the run, having left Egypt. And they have with them all the possessions that they can carry. And they're in this desert wilderness, which has very little food or water. The experts reckon that the wilderness, although it was vast, it was completely barren, and there was probably only enough food and water to support tens of thousands, and yet there are millions of them there. So they're in this, if you like, this dog-eat-dog situation. Hopefully not literally, but that's where they are. And it could have been that we could have had the Ten Commandments that started off with loving God and putting him in his right place, and then a bit of rest, and then the rest of it was all about looking after number one. Survival of the fittest, a kind of Bear Grylls experience where only those of us who are fit get to survive to the promised land. But instead, God takes the opportunity to set out a blueprint for a new kind of society where we're stronger together. This blueprint is like a calling on God's people to show the rest of the world how to live, not just for their benefit, but ultimately for the whole world's benefit. Isaiah, the prophet, talks about the people of Israel having to be a light to the nations. But it's costly, and it only works if God makes up the shortfall. Let's take as an example the first one here, honor your father and mother. This isn't just actually about being nice to your parents, but it frames the whole of Israel, the people of Israel, in the context of family, as like a model society. These Ten Commandments, they're written to like the working age man in each family. And so the parents would have been relatively elderly, kind of less useful in a crisis actually, perhaps even expendable. But who wants to live in the kind of society where our value is attributed to us by what we contribute and by how useful we are? God certainly doesn't. God's view of all of humanity is that we are built in his image. A society that worships fitness and youth and utility is destined to live without wisdom, without experience, or as St. Paul would say, like without significant parts of the body. You know, it's like the Israelites are living as if there's not enough food. Right? Imagine if we were all of us in this room trying to survive from this one bar of chocolate. How would we choose who got to eat the chocolate? Well, first of all, I'm going to have some because I'm holding it. And then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's 7 bits in there. And how are we going to decide who gets fed today? The thing is that the Israelites had this calling not to leave anybody behind. God's template only works if he makes up the shortfall. And so that's what he did in the wilderness. He provided miraculously food for everybody in the whole community to eat. He gave them manna, which is like this bread that arrived with the dew each day that tasted sweet. He provided them with flocks of quail to eat. And I don't know if you've ever eaten quail, but it's like a posh chicken that you eat in a posh restaurant. Like these, the community of Israel were provided for miraculously so that they never had to leave anybody behind. They never had to choose to only feed the fittest. Everybody got to be a part of the community. So that's what we're called to do. We're called to love like you're going to run out and trust God to make up the shortfall. It's actually the same with the other 10 commandments. Do not steal. You know, no society would approve of stealing in theory, but in a desert where you've only got enough provisions for 1 in 20 of the people, it's almost inevitable that people are going to start stealing stuff. Desperate times call for desperate measures, right? But if God provides, then there's always enough, and we don't have to steal anything. We have to love like you're going to run out and expect God to make up the shortfall. Now, you might be thinking this is all rather extreme. You might be thinking, I haven't murdered anybody. Put your hands up if you've never murdered anybody. Yeah, great, good. That's most of you. Adultery, actually don't put your hand up for that, or for stealing. But the thing is, Jesus speaks about all of this stuff. And rather than getting rid of the standards that are in the 10 Commandments, it seems like he's actually tightening them up. He says stuff like, you've heard it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. And you're kind of hoping that he's going to say, but you know, there's grace now. He doesn't say that. He says, but I tell you, anyone who is angry with a brother or a sister will be subject to judgment. He also said, you've heard that it was said, don't commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. He's reiterating for the disciples this calling on God's people to be a model society based on this blueprint for a better way of living. Maybe this current wilderness is the best place for us to learn the best way to live. We have this phrase here, inviting people into family to serve Swindon, this vision that we hold. This family, that we want to be a part of a family where whatever the trials, however long the desert experience, we want to bring everyone with us. And that necessarily forces us to lean on God to provide for us. If we learn it in the wilderness, then we'll live it in the land. So what does that look like? What does it look like to lean on God at times like this? Perhaps we need to pray each morning to be filled with the Spirit. Lord, guide me to those who are vulnerable. Guide me to those who need my help at this time. Lord, help me to love my spouse well. or to speak well of that difficult neighbour that we've all seemed to have. Or maybe you're thinking that that dog-eat-dog thing just isn't working for you and you need to find a better way this morning. Maybe you're tired of living in your own strength and you wonder why in this wilderness time there's never enough time or enough energy or even enough money. Let's begin to pray that we would know God as the provider and be released into this special pattern of living. Just imagine what our workplaces would look like if we were set free from living in the world's way and into God's way. How could we transform Swindon if we decided that no one was going to get left behind? What might our families look like if God helped us to honour each other? Perhaps even honouring the dishonourable people. Let's learn new patterns in this wilderness and take them with us into the land. Live like you're going to run out and trust God to make up the shortfall.